It started by reading and engaging with social democratic ideas from outside of Quebec. Archambault and other members of the ESP read about Christian socialism in English Canada, the ideas of trade unions in the United States, and the philosophy of the Labour Party in Great Britain. They also read all about social democratic ideas that were emerging in Francophone European countries like France and Belgium. But none of these philosophies seemed to fit the situation as they saw in Quebec. Applying these ideas to Quebec was like trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. So the ESP decided to make their own homegrown version of social democracy that was tailored to the unique circumstances of Quebec. Hi, and welcome to episode 11 of season 1 of Social Democrats of the North, presented by the Broadbent Institute's Perspectives Journal podcast series. I'm your host, Dave McGrane, a professor of political science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan, and a member of the Perspectives Journal Editorial Committee. From Confederation to the Quiet Revolution, Social Democrats of the North takes you on a journey through history to discover the lives and ideas of the leaders who have shaped Canadian social democracy. It looks at the influence of social democracy on Canadian history and draws lessons for our activism today from social democracy's past. In the last episode, I looked at Ernest and Harold Winch, two of the pioneers of social democracy in British Columbia. In this episode, I want to examine the roots of social democracy in Quebec and argue that they are deeper than you may think and more homegrown than you may think. If you learned Canadian political history in the usual way, you were probably taught that social democracy and left-wing thinking in Quebec emerged as a reaction against the Catholic Church in the 1960s. The standard story is that the left in Quebec comes out of the Quiet Revolution. It comes out of the 1960s when Quebec experienced a large amount of secularization and there was a decline in the political power of the Catholic Church. But I want to argue that this story neglects something crucial. Before Quebec had a social democratic party, before it had a modern welfare state, and before it became secularized, there was a Catholic social movement that was criticizing capitalism and calling for state intervention in the economy. And the most important expression of that Catholic social movement was the L'École Sociale Populaire, or what I'll be calling the ESP. It represents the Catholic roots of social democracy in Quebec, and its influence on Quebec politics is much more considerable than most people recognize. The L'École Sociale Populaire was founded in Montreal in 1911 by Jesuit Catholic priests, most notably Joseph Papin Archambault. Montreal in 1911 was an industrial city, and for Francophone workers, it was a brutal one to work in and live in. As these Catholic priests walked around Montreal's Francophone working-class neighborhoods, they saw injustice everywhere. They saw overcrowded housing with families with 10 children living in tiny apartments. They saw men crippled by factory accidents begging on the street. They saw mothers sending their young sons and daughters off to do child labor in massive factories. All the while, the rich businessmen of Montreal's West End got drunk on expensive champagne and ate caviar. These priests trembled with anger at what they saw. But what could they do? Where could they look for a set of ideas to solve the problem that they were encountering? In fact, they were in a tricky situation. They were forbidden by a papal decree to become directly involved in politics by running for office or starting their own political party. And they were humble parish priests, not high-ranking bishops who could influence powerful politicians and businessmen. They came up with a unique solution. They would focus on adult education. They would organize conferences, create study circles, and publish pamphlets to teach the citizens of Quebec about the suffering of the working class and talk about ways to end it. They hoped that political parties and politicians would eventually adopt their ideas when they became popular enough. These priests were bold in what they were proposing. After all, they had no real allies in the political parties that controlled Quebec politics. And their bosses, the bishops of Quebec, generally frowned upon local priests getting too involved in politics. It wasn't that the bishops thought that the Catholic Church shouldn't be involved in politics. It definitely should. Rather, the bishops saw it as their job to direct how the Catholic Church should be involved in politics. Well, the priests would essentially echo whatever the bishop said. And the Catholic Church in Quebec and its bishops weren't exactly known at the time for their critiques of capitalism. Instead of providing these priests with ideas on how to criticize capitalism, the Quebec bishops and most of the hierarchy in the Catholic Church defended the economic order and political order that existed in Quebec. There was a very real possibility that Quebec's bishops would actually publicly denounce any criticisms of capitalism made by Archambault and the ESP. In spite of all these risks, these priests committed themselves to this new organization like sailors setting out into stormy seas. For the first 20 years of their existence, it would be fair to say that the ESP organized in a quiet, methodical, and deliberate manner. It started by reading and engaging with social democratic ideas from outside of Quebec. Archambault and other members of the ESP read about Christian socialism in English Canada, the ideas of trade unions in the United States, and the philosophy of the Labour Party in Great Britain. They also read all about social democratic ideas that were emerging in Francophone European countries like France and Belgium. But none of these philosophies seemed to fit the situation as they saw in Quebec. Applying these ideas to Quebec was like trying to fit a round peg into a square hole. So the ESP decided to make their own homegrown version of social democracy that was tailored to the unique circumstances of Quebec. They called this version of social democracy Catholic social teaching. Relying on certain biblical passages and the writings of popes like Pope Leo XIII, the ESP suggested that there are moral limits on property rights. They asked if property rights of large businessmen were defended to the point of creating suffering for the working class, wasn't this an immoral situation? After all, Jesus taught us to love our brother. And Jesus preached that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. The ESP slowly began to formulate Catholic positions on just wages for workers and on workers' rights. And they began to apply these Catholic positions to understanding the structures of Quebec's economy. They started to defend the position that the poor are not poor due to their moral failings or their lack of work ethic. The moral failing is not with the poor, they said. The moral failing is with the capitalist system itself that exploits the poor to make greedy businessmen rich beyond all reasonable limits. These ideas were gradually introduced into Quebec political discourse by the ESP. The ESP understood that controversial ideas need to be introduced slowly, first in whispers, then in print, and only later loudly in public settings. But the ESP did not just create new ideas about Catholic social teaching during this formative period of its history. It also created new organizations and new institutional frameworks. It helped to found and expand the Catholic unions that represented Francophone workers in Quebec. The ESP began to run conferences called the Semaine Sociale du Canada. The goal of these conferences was to train a group of activists that would go out into Quebec society and work for the implementation of Catholic social teaching. The leaders of the ESP thought that this group of activists could become influential in various organizations and could use that influence to reduce the poverty of the Francophone working class. By the end of the 1920s, the ESP had built up an impressive network of activists who shared its way of thinking. More importantly, it had established a defensible Catholic critique of the economic injustices inherent in Quebec's economy. It had Catholicized social democracy and had formulated social democratic ideas that were applicable to the unique situation of Quebec. It had developed a homegrown version of social democracy made by Quebecers for Quebecers. Then something happened that no one was expecting. In 1929, stock markets around the world crashed, and Quebec was plunged into a deep economic recession. People who had been skeptical about what the ESP had been saying all of a sudden started to pay attention to them. The activists that the ESP had trained immediately became more influential in their organizations. And more Francophone workers sought to join the Catholic unions that the ESP had created. The ESP even got a helping hand from Rome. In 1931, Pope Pius XI wrote a papal letter that echoed many of the things that the ESP had been saying for a number of years. This letter explicitly condemned how capitalism concentrates too much wealth in the hands of a small number of rich capitalists, and it called for governments to directly intervene in the economy to create greater social and economic equality. Under the leadership of Archambault, the ESP kicked its activity into high gear. Archambault and his Jesuit colleagues stayed up late into the night writing pamphlets about the injustices of capitalism. And by day, they organized study circles and public events to spread their ideas far and wide. They believed that if enough Francophone workers and enough members of the Francophone middle class could be educated about Catholic social teaching, then Quebec could be transformed into a new and more just society. It was exhausting and exhilarating work. These priests were doing the labor of sociologists, economists, and political organizers all at once, while being careful not to say anything that would anger the bishops who were their bosses. In 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, the ESP published Le Programme de Restauration Sociale, or the Program of Social Restoration, as it would be called in English, and the program struck like a lightning bolt in Quebec politics. Everybody was talking about it. The ESP had finally attained the level of influence that it hoped that it could achieve when it was founded 20 years ago. I want to spend some time describing the Program of Social Restoration for a couple of reasons. First, it provides a really good summary of the ideas of the ESP and its Catholic social teaching. Second, it is a very important document in Quebec history. It is like the Quebec version of the Regina Manifesto, the CCF's founding document that I described in the episode on the League for Social Reconstruction. The program starts off by critiquing the Quebec economic system from a Catholic point of view. The ESP condemns the terrible exploitation of farmers, fishermen, and workers by large monopolies whose owners do not care about others in society and only think of themselves. It points out the very un-Catholic way that owners of monopoly push up prices for consumers while pushing down the wages that they pay their workers. Worse yet, the owners of these large businesses encourage unethical corruption by giving donations to political parties in exchange for these parties making laws that protected their monopolies. However, for the ESP, the role of Catholics is not to kneel and pray while ignoring that there's poverty and misery right outside the doors of their church. No, Catholics must actively try to change the politics of their society. The ESP points to Catholic unions and Catholic cooperatives as ways to do this. Catholic unions would give workers more control over their workplace and protect them from unfair labor practices. Catholic cooperatives would give fishermen and farmers control over the price at which they sold their products. Over time, these cooperatives could gradually replace the privately owned monopolies and create a more fair Quebec economy for all citizens. It is here that we can see a difference between ESP and Social Democrats in English Canada. There is much more of an element of mutual self-help in the ideas of the ESP. That is, people coming together to help themselves instead of relying on the government. I would argue that the large role played by cooperatives and unions in the ideas of the ESP shows how they adapted social democracy to the strong anti-communism, anti-statism in Quebec Catholicism in the 1930s. Quebec Catholics feared that giving too much power to the government was the start of a slippery slope towards a communist regime that would outlaw the freedom of religion that Catholics needed to practice. For the ESP, the great thing about cooperatives and unions is that they allow some control of economic institutions by average citizens, but they do not necessarily increase the power of government because both unions and cooperatives are under the democratic control of their members. Nonetheless, the ESP still saw a role for government to play in the economy. The Program of Social Restoration called for government ownership of public utilities that are natural monopolies. Here is where something that Quebec is still famous for comes into their thinking: hydroelectricity. The ESP justified the nationalization of hydroelectricity in Quebec through stating the following. I'll say it in French and then in English. They said that the exploitation de nos richesses hydrauliques au profit de la collectif est nécessaire. In English, the extraction of our natural electrical riches for the profit of the collective is necessary. The ESP also called on the Quebec provincial government to institute a minimum wage for all workers. It should be noted that there is definitely an element of sexism in the thinking of the ESP about the minimum wage, and that sexism is directly related to Quebec's situation of being a linguistic minority in Canada. In fact, the ESP called the minimum wage a salaire familial, or a family salary. And the ESP argued that a high family salary was necessary to ensure that Francophone women could stay at home and raise large families to guarantee the survival of the French-speaking Quebecois nation. In the Program for Social Restoration, there is also a strong emphasis on governments expanding the availability of agricultural land for urban workers to take over. an idea that's not found in social democratic documents from English Canada during this time period. Again, this idea is closely connected to Quebec's unique circumstance in the first half of the 20th century. It was called a strategy of, in French, retour à la terre, or return to the earth. And it was seen by the ESP as a way of reducing the urbanization of Quebec and reviving the rural traditions of Francophone Quebec that were strongly rooted in the Catholic faith. Finally, it should be noted that the ESP were committed Quebec nationalists, and this set them against Social Democrats in English Canada. When the ESP talked about government intervention in the economy, they were always talking about the Quebec provincial government intervening in the economy. And they were always concerned with how English Canadian owners and American owners of the monopolies were exploiting Francophone consumers and Francophone workers. As such, they placed a high priority on giving as much power as possible to the Quebec provincial government because it was the level of government that was most explicitly controlled by Francophones. Following the publication of the Program of Social Restoration, the ESP was at the zenith of its influence on Quebec politics, and things were starting to move fast. Up until this point in its history, politicians and political parties had never paid much attention to the ESP. But the tectonic plates of Quebec politics were shifting. The Liberals had ruled Quebec for nearly 4 decades, but their domination of political power was looking increasingly untenable under the strain of the Great Depression. On August 12, 1934, a group of left-leaning Liberals, led by Paul Gouin, broke away from the Quebec Liberal government to form their own party. They called themselves, in French, l'Action Libérale Nationale, or the ALN. They believed that the Depression demanded structural economic reform. Their big pitch to voters was that neither the Liberal government nor the Conservative official opposition had the new ideas required to get out of the Depression. But the move to radical socialism wasn't the answer either. The ALN presented itself as a third way, rejecting both laissez-faire capitalism and radical socialism. As you can see, the ALN was clearly inspired by the ideas of the ESP and its Catholic social teachings. In fact, the ALN's election manifesto borrowed heavily from the ESP's Program for Social Restoration. Like the ESP, the ALN saw the Depression as a product of a moral failure of capitalism that was caused by the concentration of too much economic power in the hands of Quebec's richest businessmen. Key ALN policy proposals, such as the nationalization of hydroelectricity and state intervention against English-owned monopolies, closely mirrored ideas that had been advanced in the pamphlets of the ESP. In short, the ESP provided the ALN with an intellectual architecture, and the ALN attempted to translate that architecture into a viable electoral program. The emergence of the ALN set up a fascinating 1935 Quebec provincial election. It was the upstart ALN against the governing Liberals and the Conservatives who had been in official opposition for many years. What happened surprised everyone. Somehow the Liberals survived the slim majority despite losing 32 seats. The ALN emerged as the official opposition with 25 seats, and the Conservatives won 17 seats. All of a sudden, there was a political party that was directly inspired by the ESP and social Catholic teaching that was the official opposition in Quebec City. The ALN was now the government waiting, and Paul Gauguin was the premier in waiting. Now, I don't think we could classify the ALN as a social democratic party. It was more a left-wing liberal party. But it was a very progressive party for its time, and it represented a realistic hope that some of the ESP's ideas could finally be put into action. However, the ESP's balloon soon burst. In a bid to oust the governing Liberals, the ALN and the Conservatives formed an electoral alliance designed not to run candidates against each other in the next election. The alliance was called the Union Nationale, and it won a landslide victory in the 1936 Quebec provincial election. After some twists and turns that I won't get into, the Conservative Party leader named Maurice Duplessis was able to seize control following the election and become premier. The ALN and the ESP believed that they would be translating Catholic social teaching into government policy following the 1936 election. Instead, Duplessis was able to consolidate his authority and shut down any movement towards left-wing political and economic reform. In the years that followed, the arch-conservative Union Nationale dominated Quebec politics. Duplessis ended up remaining premier until 1959, and the period of his government is sometimes called the Grand Noirceur, or the Great Darkeners. During this time period, Quebec gradually fell behind all other Canadian provinces in terms of the adequacy of its social programs, the modernization of its government, and rights for women and minorities. The ESP continued to fight for Catholic social teaching to become embedded in government policy during the early part of the Duplessis era. Though it must be said that its fanatical anti-communism sometimes appeared to align it with Duplessis' conservative agenda. By the end of the 1940s, the ESP was a spent force. It eventually wound down its activities in the 1950s as its leadership aged and young Francophone intellectuals on the left adopted a more critical attitude toward Catholicism. How should we evaluate the impact of the ESP on Quebec political history? I think two things stand out. First, the ESP represents the deep Catholic roots of Quebec social democracy. Unlike what some history books will tell you, social democracy is not something that emerges out of nowhere in the 1960s in Quebec. The social Catholic teachings of the ESP formed an important foundation for Quebec social democracy that is very underappreciated. It created a homegrown version of Quebec social democracy that brought the idea of capitalism being an immoral and unjust economic system into the political culture of Quebec. In this way, the ESP laid the foundation for the left-wing thinking that emerged during the Quiet Revolution in Quebec in the 1960s. Second, I think that the ESP teaches us something important for our activism today. As I've been stressing, the ESP was profoundly homegrown. While the ESP was aware of the social democratic ideas emerging in English Canada, the United States, and other countries, it strongly rejected the importation of those ideas into Quebec. From 1900 to 1950 in Quebec, social democratic ideas had to be Catholicized or they wouldn't get any traction at all. Therefore, the ESP felt compelled to create a version of social democracy that aligned with Catholic beliefs that were very deeply held by Quebecers during this time period in its history. The lesson for activism today is that we should resist the temptation to import what appears to work somewhere else into our own unique political context. English Canadian social democratic ideas cannot be directly ported into Quebec, just like American social democratic ideas cannot be directly applied to English Canada. Social democrats have to create ideas that are completely in tune with local circumstances if they want those ideas to resonate with their fellow citizens. I'm Dave McGrane, and thank you for joining me on Social Democrats of the North, a Perspectives Journal podcast series produced by the Broadbent Institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or leave a review on the Perspectives Journal's podcast on all major podcast platforms. And share with someone you know who loves Canadian political history. And subscribe to Press Progress's award-winning Sources podcast that digs deep into the news stories you won't find in any of the major newspapers. The Perspectives Journal podcast and Sources are proud members of the Harbinger Media Network, Canada's progressive podcast community. You can read more in Perspectives Journal, a publication of the Broadbent Institute, by visiting perspectivesjournal.ca. And get more from the Broadbent Institute by subscribing to our email list at broadbentinstitute.ca/subscribe. Next time, we will talk about the politician who laid the organizational and intellectual framework of the Saskatchewan CCF's historic victory in 1944. And spoiler alert, it's not Tommy Douglas. Until then, keep questioning the status quo and stay social democratic.